What you are about to read is not just another trade dispute, and it is not simply another Trump versus ally headline designed to generate noise for a single news cycle. What unfolded in early January 2026 marked a seismic rupture in North American power relations, a moment when economic pressure, political pride, and geopolitical rivalry collided in full public view. In a move that stunned diplomats, rattled markets, and ignited fury on both sides of the border, the President of the United States openly threatened to impose 100% tariffs on every single Canadian good entering the American market. Not selective tariffs, not targeted penalties, a full doubling of prices across the board. The justification was blunt and confrontational. Canada had moved forward with a strategic trade agreement with China. Before dismissing this as another tariff tantrum, it is essential to understand what is really happening. This is not primarily about electric vehicles, seafood, or canola. It is about power, obedience, and whether the most integrated trade partnership in the modern world can survive an era where loyalty is demanded rather than earned. The next 6 months will decide whether North America remains an economic bloc or fractures into rival camps driven by resentment and retaliation. Only days earlier, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney arrived in Beijing, a visit that by itself sent shockwaves through Washington. It was the first official visit by a Canadian leader to China in nearly a decade, following years of diplomatic frost, mutual sanctions, and open hostility. Cameras captured Carney stepping into the Great Hall of the People, sitting face-to-face with President Xi Jinping, a tableau that would have been politically unthinkable just a few years earlier. Behind closed doors, negotiators hammered out a deal that immediately redrew trade lines. Canada agreed to allow tens of thousands of Chinese electric vehicles into its domestic market at sharply reduced tariff rates. In exchange, China slashed punitive tariffs on Canadian canola and eliminated duties on Canadian seafood entirely. Carney framed the agreement as pragmatic, necessary, and overdue. In Canada's agricultural heartland, the reaction was explosive. Prairie provinces that had watched their export markets collapse under Chinese retaliation suddenly saw hope return. Fishing communities on the Atlantic coast celebrated openly. But in Ontario, the mood was fury. Auto sector leaders and provincial officials accused Ottawa of selling out domestic workers. Some went further, branding Chinese electric vehicles as security threats and accusing the federal government of inviting foreign influence into critical infrastructure. That domestic division was only the beginning. Within days, Carney appeared on the world stage again, this time at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. There, in front of global executives, political leaders, and an international press corps hungry for confrontation, Carney delivered a speech that detonated like a political grenade. He declared that the global system was experiencing a rupture, not a transition. The old order, he said, was finished. Supply chains were being weaponized. Tariffs were no longer economic tools, but instruments of coercion. Middle powers that failed to stand together, he warned, would find themselves devoured by stronger states. He never mentioned Trump by name, but the target was unmistakable. The response inside the hall was electric. A standing ovation followed, not polite applause, but sustained, deliberate approval from an audience that had watched Washington threaten allies, flirt with annexation rhetoric, and treat decades-old agreements as disposable leverage. Then came Trump's turn. His speech was defiant, combative, and personal. He mocked foreign leaders, revived territorial demands, and dismissed allied dependence as weakness. When he turned to Canada, the language hardened. Canada exists because of the United States, he declared publicly, warning Carney to remember that fact. It was not policy analysis. It was dominance rhetoric. Carney responded within hours. Canada does not exist because of the United States, he said. Canada thrives because of Canadian democracy, Canadian institutions, and Canadian resolve. That refusal to submit marked the true breaking point. Invitations were withdrawn. Advisory roles were revoked. Social media attacks escalated, and then came the threat that reverberated across markets and ministries alike: 100% tariffs if Canada proceeds with its China deal. Here is where most mainstream coverage gets it wrong. This is not simply wounded ego or personal retaliation, although pride and anger clearly play a role. The tariff threat is a strategic maneuver tied directly to the upcoming mandatory review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, scheduled for mid-2026. That review will determine whether the agreement continues smoothly or enters a prolonged period of instability that could end in total collapse. Trump has long argued that the deal disadvantages the United States. He has already imposed steep tariffs on Canadian goods, threatened withdrawal, and floated replacing the trilateral framework with bilateral arrangements designed to maximize American leverage. China is the accelerant. For years, American trade officials have accused Beijing of exploiting North American supply chains by routing goods through Canada and Mexico to bypass U.S. tariffs. Whether this occurs at scale is still debated, but perception matters more than proof in the current political climate. From Washington's perspective, Canada's willingness to reopen its market to Chinese electric vehicles looks like an open invitation to circumvention. It looks like defiance. At this point, pause and consider this question. Should Canada have the right to pursue independent trade relationships, even if they conflict with U.S. strategic priorities, or does economic integration require political submission? Trump's camp argues that decoupling from China is impossible if allies refuse to align fully. From that vantage point, Canada's move undermines an entire containment strategy. But Ottawa's calculation is different. Canada is not pivoting toward China out of affection. It is diversifying out of necessity. Years of tariff threats, annexation jokes, and unpredictable policy reversals have made exclusive dependence on the U.S. market feel reckless. When your closest partner treats access as a weapon, you look for alternatives. Carney has made diversification a central pillar of his economic vision. Reduce dependence on a single buyer, expand trade with Asia and Europe, build resilience against political volatility. That strategy terrifies Washington because leverage evaporates when dependence fades. A Canada that can sell to China, Europe, and emerging markets is a Canada less vulnerable to threats. And this is where hostility intensifies. Trump's tariff authority has largely survived legal challenges. If he follows through, the damage would be immediate and mutual. Billions of dollars in goods cross the border daily. Energy, steel, agriculture, manufacturing, and electricity markets are deeply intertwined. Doubling prices overnight would not punish Ottawa alone. It would hammer American consumers, manufacturers, and workers. Economists warn of recessionary shocks, supply chain paralysis, and factory shutdowns across both countries. Trump insists the pain is worth it. In his view, economic shock is not a risk, but a tool. Pressure, he believes, produces obedience. Tariffs are not merely a policy instrument. They are a test of will. His assumption is simple and blunt. When costs rise high enough, allies will break first. Markets will complain, businesses will lobby, politicians will panic, and eventually, governments will fall back into line. From this perspective, short-term disruption is a price worth paying if it reasserts dominance and restores leverage. Mark Carney, however, is wagering on the opposite outcome. His calculation is not rooted in spreadsheets or trade flow models, but in political behavior under sustained stress. He is betting that American businesses reliant on cross-border supply chains, U.S. voters facing higher prices, and state governments whose economies are intertwined with Canada will not quietly absorb the damage. He is betting that internal pressure inside the United States will grow louder and more destabilizing than external pressure applied to Canada. This is not a conventional economic gamble. It is a test of political endurance, institutional resilience, and public tolerance for self-inflicted harm. Now pause and consider the broader implication. If the United States is prepared to threaten its closest ally with economic devastation over a trade disagreement, What message does that send to every other partner watching from Europe to Asia? What signal does it send to countries that have built their security, supply chains, and diplomatic strategies around long-term alignment with Washington? The answer is already becoming visible. That question is reshaping global behavior in real time. Allies are no longer assuming permanence. They are quietly hedging, diversifying partnerships, and reducing exposure to unilateral pressure. Strategic autonomy, once a theoretical concept debated in policy papers, is becoming an operational priority. Governments are asking not whether they trust the United States today, but whether they can afford to depend on it tomorrow. Trust, once fractured, is not easily restored, and credibility erodes faster than it can be rebuilt. The post-war economic and political system rested on a shared assumption that agreements carried weight beyond convenience, that commitments survived leadership changes, and that coercion had limits even among unequal partners. Stability mattered because it allowed long-term planning, investment, and cooperation. Today, those assumptions are under visible strain. When agreements become bargaining chips and loyalty is enforced through punishment, the foundation of that system weakens. As negotiations move forward, every signal now carries outsized importance. Tone matters, timing matters, silence matters. Does Canada soften its stance in the face of mounting threats? Or does it double down and absorb the pressure? Does Washington escalate further, or does it recalibrate once domestic costs become unavoidable? The mid-2026 trade review is no longer a technical exercise handled by trade lawyers and economists. It has become a referendum on whether cooperation can survive intimidation and whether partnership still outweighs raw leverage. This confrontation is not truly about electric vehicles, seafood exports, or tariff schedules. Those are surface issues, useful symbols in a deeper struggle. At its core, this is a clash between sovereignty and submission, between rule-based cooperation and power-based enforcement. Carney has chosen confrontation because the alternative, permanent vulnerability to external pressure, is politically and strategically unsustainable. Trump has chosen escalation because leverage, not compromise, is his preferred language of negotiation. One side will eventually blink, or both economies will pay a price that neither initially intended to bear. We are now standing at the edge of a defining moment. A moment that will determine whether North America remains a shared economic project built on mutual dependence or fractures into hostile camps driven by resentment, retaliation, and mistrust. The outcome will not only shape trade flows and investment decisions, it will redefine how allies interpret American leadership itself. What happens next will echo far beyond borders and balance sheets because once trust is replaced by fear, the damage is rarely contained to a single dispute. So let me ask you directly, and I want your honest take in the comments. Should Canada stand firm even if it risks economic pain, or should it retreat to preserve short-term stability? And beyond that, do you believe alliances can survive when power replaces partnership as the organizing principle? This story is far from over. The next chapter will be written as negotiations intensify and deadlines approach. Stay engaged, because the decisions made in the coming months will echo for decades. And when the dust settles, we will all live with the consequences of who chose cooperation and who chose confrontation.